The Ship of Theseus Paradox. Imagine a ship gliding slowly across the calm surface of the Aegean Sea. Its sails stretch wide in the morning light, catching the breeze like quiet wings. The hull creaks rhythmically as it moves, a familiar sound to those who know the sea well. Waves kiss the sides of the vessel, rising and falling in a timeless, breath-like rhythm. This is no ordinary ship. We're told it once belonged to the great hero Theseus. The very same Theseus who braved the labyrinth and faced the Minotaur. This ship bore him to Crete, carried him through peril and triumph, and returned him home a changed man. It is more than wood and rope. It is memory. It is myth. It is, in every sense, a vessel for meaning. Years pass. Generations come and go. And as the ship rests in the harbor, age takes its toll. Salt air softens the beams. Rain darkens the deck. Bit by bit, the shipwrights tend to it. They remove one rotting plank and replace it with a new one. A mast is swapped out. The sails are stitched anew. Always careful. Always faithful to the original form. Centuries go by, and by the time the last original piece is gone, a question quietly arises. If every single part has been replaced, is it still the Ship of Theseus? It still floats. It still bears the same name. It still stands in the same harbor, honored by the same people. But is it the same? Some say yes. That identity lies in continuity, in the story that never stopped. That a river is still a river, even if every drop of water in it changes. But others say no. That when the last plank was removed, the ship became something new. Now imagine this. A philosopher, or perhaps a curious shipwright, had been saving the discarded parts all along. Each board, each rope, each nail carefully set aside. And with patient hands, they begin to rebuild the ship, using only the original materials. Every creak of the old wood echoes a memory. Every fiber of the sail whispers of ancient winds. When this second ship is complete, identical in shape, yet older in soul, we are faced with a new question. Which one is the real Ship of Theseus? Is it the one that changed slowly, maintaining its journey, adapting piece by piece? Or is it the one built from the original substance, even though it paused in time? This is the paradox. And perhaps the answer is not meant to be found in logic, but in reflection. Because if the ship can change and still be called itself, what does that say about you? You too have been quietly rebuilt. Your thoughts, your memories, your body itself, none of them are exactly as they were years ago. Cells regenerate. Beliefs evolve. You are the product of continuous change. And yet, you are still you. A name. A presence. A thread running through time. The Ship of Theseus invites us not just to ponder identity, but to feel it. To understand that change does not always erase us. That who we are is not found in one moment or one piece, but in the movement between them. A self that flows like water, that persists even as it transforms. So as you rest now, drifting through the soft waters of thought, let yourself imagine that ship, gliding silently across the moonlit sea, carrying memories, carrying time, carrying something that cannot be taken apart. You are the ship, you are the journey, and you are still whole, even as you change. The paradox of the stone. Imagine an old monastery perched high in the misty hills where clouds drift low and birds call out across the open sky. In the garden beyond its stone walls, a monk sits in stillness. He has been meditating for hours, his breath soft, his mind quiet. Beside him rests a single stone, worn smooth by time. Its surface is cool, untouched by urgency. One day, a student approaches the monk and asks a question. "Master," he says, "can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that even they cannot lift it?" The monk opens his eyes and smiles, not with amusement, but with understanding. Because this question is not new. It is ancient. It is the paradox of the stone. It sounds simple, but as your mind reaches for an answer, it quickly finds itself tangled. If the being is truly all-powerful, it should be able to create such a stone. But if the being creates it and cannot lift it, then there is something it cannot do. It cannot lift the stone. And if it cannot lift the stone, is it still all-powerful? Yet if the being cannot create the stone in the first place, then again, there is something it cannot do. In either case, there seems to be a limit, a boundary. And in a being that is supposed to be limitless, a boundary is a contradiction. The question loops endlessly, folding in on itself like a snake swallowing its own tail. But let's pause, because the power of this paradox isn't in solving it. It lies in the way it makes your thoughts slow down, in how it pulls you inward like a quiet riddle whispered by the universe. It invites you to explore the very idea of limits and the illusions we build around them. What does it mean to be all-powerful? Is it the ability to do anything, even things that contradict themselves? Can a being create a square circle? Can it draw a mountain without a valley? Can it will itself to cease existing? These are not just questions about theology or gods. They are questions about logic, language, and the edges of understanding. Because the paradox exposes something subtle. Some things are not limits of power, but limits of coherence. A stone so heavy it can't be lifted by an all-powerful being is not a meaningful task, it's a linguistic trap. A contradiction dressed in the costume of a question. It's like asking, can an unstoppable force meet an immovable object? The question falls apart not because the answer is too deep, but because the question itself collapses. And yet, there's beauty in the collapse, because it shows us that even thought, so sharp, so clever, has its boundaries. And at the edge of thought, there is silence. Perhaps that is what the monk understands, that the paradox is not meant to be conquered. It is meant to be sat with, like a koan whispered in the ear of a restless mind. Let's imagine now, just for a moment, that you are the one holding the stone. It feels heavy in your palm, not in mass, but in meaning. You turn it over, feel its shape. And for a moment, you wonder, what if the stone is not a puzzle, but a mirror? What if it shows you the limits of control, the impossibility of total mastery, not just of the world, but of your own thoughts? So many of us chase the idea of being all-powerful in our own lives. We try to control every outcome. We carry expectations like stones, beliefs we must never drop, burdens we feel we must always lift. But perhaps, like the being in the paradox, we find ourselves trapped. Because in trying to be invincible, we forget how to rest, how to let go, how to be gentle with the weight we carry. Maybe the lesson is not in finding a being who can lift every stone, but in learning which stones to set down. There is freedom in recognizing the boundaries of our minds. There is peace in allowing questions to remain questions. Not every door must be opened. Not every thought must be untangled. Sometimes, as sleep approaches, it is enough to sit quietly beside the paradox, to breathe slowly, to feel the stone in your hand grow lighter, not because it has changed, but because you no longer need to lift it. Let the question fade. Let it drift like mist between the mountains, soft and unsolved, like a dream that ends before the answer. In that space of unknowing, there is rest, and the stone, untouched, remains exactly where it needs to be. The Barber Paradox. Imagine a small village nestled in a quiet valley, where the sun rises gently over hills draped in morning mist. The village is peaceful, with cobblestone streets, chirping birds, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery. Children laugh in the distance, wind chimes sing in doorways, and a cat naps on a sun-warmed window ledge. But at the center of the village, there's a curious little shop with a striped pole turning slowly in the breeze. It is the barber's shop, and here begins a paradox. The barber in this village is a tidy man. He keeps his scissors sharp, his floor swept clean, and his hours consistent. He has one very simple rule. He shaves all those in the village who do not shave themselves, and only those who do not shave themselves. It's a neat arrangement. If a man in the village prefers not to shave, he visits the barber. If he likes to take care of it himself, he stays away. But one quiet morning, as the barber opens his shutters and prepares his tools, a question arises, like a breeze disturbing still water. Does the barber shave himself? At first, it seems harmless, almost silly. But then your mind begins to loop. If the barber shaves himself, then by the rule, he must not shave himself, because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he must shave himself, because he shaves all those who don't shave themselves. And so, the question folds in on itself like a hallway with mirrors on both ends. You walk forward, but never reach a door. You see the image of a solution, but it slips away as you draw close. This is the Barber Paradox. It was first introduced by the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century, not as a joke or riddle, but as a way to expose a flaw in how we try to organize logic. Because the barber's rule, though simple in appearance, creates a contradiction. It breaks the very foundation it's built upon. The barber cannot exist, not with that rule. The conditions cancel each other out like trying to stand in two places at once. It's a paradox born not of mystery, but of precision taken too far, like building a machine so exact that it collapses under its own instructions. And yet, there's something comforting in this contradiction, because it reminds us that even logic has limits, that sometimes our desire to put everything in neat little boxes, to categorize, define, and rule can backfire. That in trying to make the world too tidy, we end up making it impossible. Let's go back to the village for a moment. Let's imagine that the barber, weary of the question, simply chooses not to follow the rule anymore. Maybe he shaves whoever he pleases. Maybe he lets his beard grow long in protest. And maybe, just maybe, the paradox disappears. Not because it was solved, but because the need for absolute structure gave way to something gentler, something human. Sometimes the trap isn't the question. It's the belief that every system must be perfect, that every rule must be airtight, that every contradiction must be resolved. But life is messier than that. There are gray areas, exceptions, quiet rebellions against order. And in those spaces, we often find the most peace. Maybe the barber is not meant to be understood, but to be released, set down like a thought too heavy to carry before sleep. Let the village grow quiet again. Let the paradox fade into the background, like the hum of distant conversation or the rustling of leaves. And let your mind soften, not with answers, but with the freedom to let the question be. Because sometimes, sleep comes not with solving the puzzle, but with accepting that not all puzzles need to be solved. So the barber closes his shop for the day. The pole spins lazily in the breeze, and the village returns to its rhythm. The contradiction remains, unsolved, unbroken, and entirely at peace. The twin paradox. Imagine two twins identical in every way, born on the same day in the same hospital under the same sky. They share memories, laughter, stories whispered under blankets, dreams spun in the quiet moments of childhood. But now one of them is about to leave Earth. Let's say his name is Elias. He boards a sleek silver spacecraft, its surface gleaming under a sun that's just beginning to rise. He is chosen for a mission, an expedition to a distant star. The spacecraft is designed to travel near the speed of light, skimming the edge of time itself. His twin, Theo, stays behind. And as the engines ignite and the stars blur into streaks beyond the window, a strange question begins to emerge, one that will linger in the stillness of space and in the ticking of clocks on Earth. When Elias returns, who will be older? It seems like a simple question. Two brothers, two clocks, one long journey. But the answer, like the voyage itself, is anything but simple. You see, time, as it turns out, is not absolute. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, time bends and stretches depending on how fast you move. The faster you travel, especially near the speed of light, the slower time flows for you, compared to someone standing still. So, as Elias races through space, months passing for him aboard the ship. Years may pass for Theo back home. Birthdays come and go. Leaves fall. Cities rise and fade. And when Elias finally returns, stepping off the ship, the world feels older. And Theo looks older too. Much older. Elias has aged just a few years. But Theo, his twin, has lived decades. This is the twin paradox. But wait, if motion is relative, doesn't that mean Elias could consider himself standing still? That it was Earth and Theo who were moving? Shouldn't both twins see the other as aging slower? Here, the paradox deepens. It's not just a riddle of physics, but of perspective, of identity, of who is truly in motion. The resolution, physicists tell us, lies in acceleration. Elias's journey isn't just a smooth ride, it involves turning around, reversing direction, decelerating, accelerating again. These changes break the symmetry. Theo stays in one constant frame. Elias doesn't. In this breaking of symmetry, the universe chooses sides, and time plays its trick. Still, there's something haunting about the thought that two people born in the same moment could live such different timelines simply by taking different paths. One twin becomes a time traveler, not through wormholes or fantasy, but through speed and silence and distance. It makes you wonder, how many ways are there to stretch a lifetime? What if time is less like a river and more like a thread, one that can be pulled, twisted, or slackened, depending on how you move through the world? Let's pause for a moment. Imagine Elias, back home now, sitting across from Theo. One with memories of stars, the other with memories of years. Do they feel like brothers still? Can time between people be measured only by clocks? Or is it something more, something emotional, intangible? The twin paradox doesn't just bend the laws of physics. It bends the soul. It touches on what it means to age, to part, to return, and to find that while the heart stayed tethered, time did not. In a way, this paradox is not just about motion. It's about the impossibility of perfect reunion, about how even the most synchronized lives can slip out of sync, not by choice, but by the nature of reality itself. And in that slip, there is wonder. There is melancholy. There is something deeply human. Perhaps you felt it too, when you reconnect with someone you haven't seen in years, and you both feel the passage of time differently, as if your experiences, though shared in essence, have aged in separate pockets of the universe. The twin paradox gives form to that feeling. It makes science of longing, and it turns relativity into poetry. So now drift back with Elias, to the stars that no longer look the same, to the earth that spun a little faster in his absence, to the brother whose eyes carry stories he wasn't there to see. And let your thoughts slow down. Let them stretch like light across space. Because in sleep, we are all time travelers, moving in stillness, aging in dreams. The clocks can tick as they will. We are not bound by them. The paradox of the ravens. Picture a quiet countryside. A long dirt path winds through fields of golden grass. The morning fog is lifting, and dew clings gently to leaves and fence posts. In the distance, you spot a lone raven perched on a crooked branch, its black feathers shimmering like wet ink against the soft blue sky. You pause, not just because of its beauty, but because that raven holds a curious secret, one that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for decades. It's a paradox, wrapped not in danger or urgency, but in logic, and in the assumptions we carry quietly through life. Let's begin with a simple idea. All ravens are black, a straightforward statement, one you might accept without much thought. After all, how often have you seen a raven that wasn't? But now ask yourself, how do we know it's true? We can't inspect every raven in existence. There are too many, and some perhaps are yet to be seen. So we rely on confirmation. Each time we observe a black raven, we gain a little more confidence that the statement is true. One black raven, then another, then another. But here's where the paradox unfolds. Philosopher Carl Hempel asked, if seeing a black raven confirms that all ravens are black, then anything that supports the logical structure of that statement should also serve as confirmation. So let's rephrase it. All ravens are black is logically equivalent to, if something is not black, then it is not a raven. That might seem like a linguistic trick, but in the cold language of logic, these two statements mean the same thing. Now imagine this. You're in a cozy kitchen. A red apple sits on the table. According to logic, this non-black, non-raven object, the apple, confirms the idea that if something is not black, it is not a raven. And so, it also supports the statement, all ravens are black, a red apple, confirming something about ravens. This feels wrong, absurd even. What could a red apple possibly have to do with ravens? But the paradox persists. Logically, it holds. Emotionally, intuitively, it resists. Why? Because while logic is clean, our minds are messy. They value relevance, context, meaning. Observing black ravens feels like gaining real knowledge. It aligns with the purpose of the statement. But seeing a red apple feels irrelevant, even if technically it isn't. So the paradox exposes something delicate, a gap between formal reasoning and human understanding, between what logic allows and what feels meaningful. It's a reminder that confirmation isn't just about math or truth tables. It's about usefulness, expectation, interpretation, and this strange little puzzle born from a statement about ravens forces us to confront the limits of knowledge itself. Because how often do we mistake coincidence for cause? How often do we confuse association with certainty? In a world flooded with information, are we always sure what actually confirms what? The paradox of the ravens doesn't just twist a rule. It taps on the glass of our assumptions, gently, persistently, and when it does, we begin to see cracks, not in truth, but in the way we pursue it. Let's return now to that black raven, still perched, still watching, still silent. Its presence feels meaningful, more so than the apple in your hand. But maybe the paradox whispers, it's not always what we see that matters. Sometimes it's how we see it, and what we believe it confirms. So let your thoughts drift like the morning mist, settling over logic, over language, not to solve the puzzle, but to sit with it, to feel its shape, to let its quiet contradiction guide you gently toward rest. Because not every riddle is meant to be untangled. Some are meant to remind us, even in sleep, that truth is never quite as simple as black or white. The Zeno's arrow paradox. Close your eyes and imagine a warm, still afternoon in ancient Greece. The sun casts long, honey-colored shadows across white stone temples. Cicadas hum in the olive trees, and a soft breeze rustles the tall grass of the open plains. In the distance, a lone archer stands silent, focused. She raises her bow. The arrow, slender and straight, rests lightly between her fingers. Time seems to hold its breath as she pulls the string back. And then releases. The arrow flies. It slices through the air with perfect grace, moving swiftly toward its mark. But what if I told you that arrow is not moving at all? This is the paradox of Zeno, a philosopher who lived over 2,000 years ago, and who dared to challenge not just the movement of arrows, but the very nature of motion itself. Let's unravel it together. Zeno's arrow paradox begins with a question simple yet strange. If time is made up of individual moments, then what is happening to the arrow in any one of those moments? Imagine freezing time, not in slow motion, but stopping it completely. Taking a single frame, a single instant, and examining it. In that instant, the arrow is still. It occupies a precise position in space. It is not moving forward. It is not moving backward. It just is. Now, take the next instant. And the next. And again, the arrow is simply at a place. Still. Frozen. Always in a single spot during each moment. If we add up all of these instants, each one motionless, how Zeno asks, can they suddenly create motion? How can a sum of stillness ever become movement? It's a haunting question, one that forces us to question whether motion is an illusion, a trick played by our minds as we stitch together moments like frames in a film reel. Because isn't that what we do? We don't see every detail of the arrow's journey. We see a blur, a suggestion, a story of motion told by countless still images flickering too fast for us to notice the gaps. So, is the arrow flying? Or are we simply dreaming it forward? Zeno's paradox doesn't stop there. It pokes at the fabric of time itself. What is a moment? Is time smooth and flowing like a river? Or is it granular, made up of indivisible atomic instants? If the latter is true, then motion, as we understand it, begins to crumble. An arrow, frozen in every individual frame of time, can never truly be in motion because motion requires change. And in each frozen instant, nothing changes. It's not a question of speed. It's not even about distance. It's about existence within time. And so, the paradox becomes unsettling, like a dream you can't quite explain. Because we see motion everywhere. We feel it in our bodies. We trust it. But Zeno quietly asks, what if it's all a trick of perception? Science has tried to answer. Calculus, developed thousands of years after Zeno, provides tools to deal with continuous change. It explains that movement isn't about individual snapshots, but about limits and smooth transitions. But even now, in the quantum age, the paradox echoes. What is motion when particles jump from place to place? When the universe operates in discrete packets of energy and time, at the smallest scales at the edge of knowledge, Zeno's arrow still hangs in the air, waiting, not falling, not flying, just existing. Let your thoughts settle into that strange space, a place where movement might be made of stillness, where time may not flow but flicker, and where reality feels, just for a moment, like a puzzle without a key. This paradox doesn't shout. It doesn't demand panic or urgency. It simply rests like the arrow in midair, inviting you to pause, to wonder, to drift gently into stillness. Because in the world Zeno offers, even movement becomes calm, even flight becomes peace. And in the quiet, you might find that your own racing thoughts, like the arrow, can pause and rest and float, just for a while. The Bootstrap Paradox. Imagine a dusty library at the edge of town. The air smells of old paper and time, soft, weightless, a little musty. Outside, rain taps gently on the windows as if knocking on forgotten memories. Inside, it's quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like it's been sitting there for years, waiting. You wander between the tall shelves, fingertips brushing cracked leather spines. Then one book catches your eye. Not because of the title. It has none. Just a simple, worn cover and a feeling, like it wants to be found. You open it. The pages are filled with handwriting, your handwriting. Only you don't remember writing it. As you flip through, your heart quickens. Inside are detailed notes, equations, diagrams, and an invention. A machine. Something impossible, something revolutionary. You don't know how you know it works, but you do. It's like reading a dream you haven't dreamed yet. Years pass. Inspired by that mysterious book, you build the machine. You study. You refine. You succeed. And in your later years, you return to that same library, now older, quieter, maybe forgotten. And you place the book back on the shelf. Exactly where you found it. The loop is complete. But where did the book come from? This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a time travel paradox that unravels the thread of causality. Named after the phrase pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It asks a haunting question. Can an object or an idea exist without ever being created? Let's break it down. In this story, the book was never written. It was passed from future to past like a whisper echoing in a loop. You found it. You used it. You returned it. But no one, not you, not anyone else, actually authored the information inside. It just appeared. Cause and effect collapse into each other. Each one feeding the other in a perfect circle. A loop with no beginning. No origin. It's like a song that sings itself or a mirror reflecting another mirror. Infinite, recursive, and eerily empty. The Bootstrap Paradox shows us a version of time that doesn't flow like a river, but curls back on itself like a snake swallowing its own tail. It invites us to imagine a world where information, objects, or people exist not because they were made, but because they were looped into existence. It sounds impossible, but in physics, in the strange and slippery world of space-time, it's not so easily dismissed. Some solutions to Einstein's equations allow for closed time-like curves, paths through the universe that loop back on themselves. In such a world, a traveler could revisit the past, and with them ideas, machines, books could follow. So then we ask, if the past can be influenced by the future, who or what started the loop? And the deeper we go, the more the edges blur. Let's try another story. A composer wakes from a dream. In it, a melody, beautiful, haunting. He writes it down before it fades. It becomes his most famous work. Years later, a young girl hears the melody, is inspired, grows up, and becomes a music teacher. She passes the melody on generation after generation until one day, the same composer as a child hears it from his teacher. He grows. He dreams. He writes it down. So again, where did the melody come from? The Bootstrap Paradox suggests that some things might not need origins, that a loop can sustain itself forever, unanchored to a beginning. But this defies our intuition. We're creatures of cause and effect. We need origins, sources, reasons. Yet this paradox invites us to surrender the comfort, to let go of beginnings, and drift instead in a circle that never starts and never ends. It's unsettling, yes, but also strangely soothing. Because in this loop, there's no rush, no race to find the first, only continuity, like a breath repeating itself. Inhale, exhale, again. Some physicists argue this paradox doesn't violate any known laws. That if time travel were possible, the universe would self-consistently resolve these loops. Meaning, if you bring a book back in time, it was always there. No contradiction. Just a story with no first page. Others worry that the paradox threatens the foundations of logic and information, that it creates something from nothing. But maybe that's the point. The Bootstrap Paradox stretches the boundaries of what we think is possible. It whispers of a universe not ruled by straight lines, but by spirals and echoes. And in that spiral, we find a strange kind of peace. The peace of not needing to know where it began. The peace of accepting the mystery. Of resting in the loop. Of letting go. So if ever you find yourself lost in thought, looping through memories, ideas, dreams, pause and listen. You might hear the echo of something timeless. Not from the past, not from the future, but from somewhere in between. From the loop itself, the unexpected hanging paradox. A small, quiet courtroom sits beneath the waning afternoon sun. The air is still, the wooden bench is polished with age, and in the center stands a man, calm, composed, and waiting for judgment. The judge looks down at him with solemn eyes and speaks. You will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week, but the execution will be a surprise. You will not know the day of the hanging until the executioner comes to your cell that morning. The man is taken away, and the days begin to pass. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but he is still alive, still waiting. And as he waits, a strange loop begins to form. Not in time, but in his mind. This is the unexpected hanging paradox. A riddle not just of logic, but of belief, of certainty, of knowledge, and the slippery ground beneath our expectations. Let's rewind and walk through the man's thoughts. He thinks to himself, if I haven't been hanged by Thursday night, then the execution must be on Friday. But if I know that, then it won't be a surprise, so it can't be Friday. He crosses Friday off the list. Now he turns to Thursday. If I haven't been hanged by Wednesday night and Friday's ruled out, then it must be Thursday. But again, if I can predict that, then it won't be a surprise. So Thursday, too, is eliminated. And with that logic, he moves backwards, eliminating every day one by one. Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday. By Sunday night, he smiles. I cannot be hanged at all. The surprise is impossible. He sleeps soundly, comforted by logic. Safe, he thinks, in the arms of certainty. But then, on Wednesday morning, the guard unlocks his cell. He's let out, confused and protesting. And as the noose is prepared, the man realizes he is completely surprised. The paradox has come to life. So what went wrong? It wasn't the judge's sentence. It was carried out exactly as promised. It wasn't the surprise, it was, in fact, unexpected. What broke was his assumption that logic could map the unknowable. That prediction could master uncertainty. That by eliminating all possibilities, he could control fate. But fate, like paradox, has its own rhythm. The unexpected hanging paradox plays a trick not on reality, but on epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. It challenges what it means to know something. Can we know a surprise if we're told about it in advance? Can logic predict events that depend on our own expectations? Some philosophers argue that the paradox exposes a gap between truth and belief. The judge's statement is true. The hanging is a surprise. But any attempt to deduce when it will happen disrupts the very condition of surprise. The prisoner's reasoning was valid, but flawed in its foundation. It assumed that knowing the future changes the future. But perhaps there are truths we cannot access until they arrive. Just like in dreams, where you think you've understood the rules, only to find they dissolve when you look too closely. In classrooms and books, the unexpected hanging paradox is more than a thought experiment. It's a meditation on the limits of rational thought. It's used to explore logical systems, temporal logic, and the nature of announcements and surprise. And in the quiet of a cell, it is a story about control, about how we try to shield ourselves from the unknown by reasoning it out of existence. But the unknown does not bow to logic, creeps in sideways. It hides in the folds of certainty, and when we least expect it, it arrives. The man who thought he could outwit time is reminded that time always has the final move. And so, as you drift to sleep tonight, consider this. How much of what you expect is shaped by assumptions? How many of your certainties are just the stories you've told yourself to feel safe? The unexpected hanging paradox doesn't just twist logic. It humbles it. It whispers that not all things can be predicted, that sometimes the surprise is the point. And in the quiet hours, just before sleep takes you, that thought can be strangely calming. The Sorites Paradox. Imagine standing on the edge of a vast, endless desert. Before you lies a shimmering sea, not of water, but of sand stretching beyond the horizon, golden and endless under a soft, setting sun. A single grain of sand slips slowly through your fingers, falling silently onto the ground. One grain. It feels insignificant, barely there. Just a speck. Now imagine adding one more grain. And another. And another. You gather more grains, handful after handful, until a small pile begins to form. The pile grows, rising gently in the sand, grain by grain, until what was once nothing becomes something. A heap. But here's the question that has puzzled thinkers for thousands of years. When does a collection of grains become a heap? Is it after 10 grains? 100? 1,000? The answer seems obvious until you look closer. If one grain is not a heap, and adding one grain can't suddenly transform something from not a heap to a heap, then how do you ever get a heap at all? This is the heart of the Sorites Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, where vague boundaries and gradual change collide to create a puzzle without a clear answer. Let's step through it together. Imagine a single grain of sand on the desert floor. It's not a heap. One grain cannot be called a heap. Now, if one grain is not a heap, then adding just one more grain shouldn't suddenly create a heap. 2 grains? Still not a heap. 3 grains? 4? 5. Each step seems too small, too insignificant. So logically, no matter how many grains you add, one by one, it seems you never get a heap. But that defies common sense. We know what a heap is. We see it. We feel it. A big pile of sand is unmistakably a heap. The paradox arises from the vagueness in language and categories. Words like heap or bald or tall don't have exact thresholds. They exist in the fuzzy middle ground where definitions blur. But the Sorites Paradox isn't just a linguistic curiosity. It points to a deeper truth about how we perceive change, categories, and the world itself. Change rarely happens in sudden leaps. It's gradual, continuous, almost imperceptible at each moment. And yet, over time, those tiny changes accumulate and the world transforms. Think about aging. A child grows year by year. Each birthday barely different from the last, but eventually becomes an adult. When exactly did the child become an adult? There's no sharp line, just a slow unfolding. Or think about a color fading. A bright red apple exposed to sunlight day after day slowly loses its vibrancy. When does it stop being red? When does it become orange? There is no clear answer, only a spectrum. This paradox gently invites us to embrace uncertainty, to accept that not all questions have precise answers, that some boundaries are naturally fuzzy, that reality isn't always divided into black and white, but exists in gradients and shades. In this way, the Sorites Paradox becomes a meditation on the limits of language and logic, on the imperfection of human categories trying to map a fluid world. But what about practical life? Does the paradox matter when we're deciding if a pile of sand is big enough to build a castle, or if a person is old enough to vote? In everyday life, context helps us. We use shared understanding and approximate thresholds. But the paradox reminds us to stay humble, to remember the gray areas. It whispers that certainty can be elusive, that sometimes the best we can do is acknowledge the blurred edges and live within them. So next time you see a pile of sand, or watch leaves change color, or think about a slow change happening around you, pause. Remember the paradox. The world isn't always clear-cut. Not everything fits neatly into boxes. And maybe that's okay. Maybe life is about embracing the in-between, the not quite, the slowly changing. After all, even the smallest grain of sand is part of a heap. And that heap, in turn, is part of the vast, shimmering desert we all stand within. The paradox of the unexpected exam. Imagine a quiet classroom early on a Monday morning. Soft sunlight filters through the windows, casting long shadows across empty desks. The air is still, carrying the faint scent of chalk dust and old books. The teacher stands at the front, chalk in hand, ready to deliver a surprising announcement. Next week, the teacher says, voice calm but deliberate, there will be an exam. A pause, then. But here's the catch, you won't know which day it will be. It will be a surprise. The students shift in their seats, some exchange puzzled glances. How can an exam be both scheduled and yet a surprise? Isn't an exam supposed to be something you prepare for, expect? This simple statement, at first, seems straightforward. But it hides a fascinating and perplexing paradox, a logical puzzle that has baffled thinkers for generations. It's called the paradox of the unexpected exam, or sometimes the surprise exam paradox. Let's unravel this paradox slowly, like peeling back the layers of a mystery. You know the exam will take place on one day between Monday and Friday. It could be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. But you also know that on the morning of the exam, you will not be able to predict with certainty that it will be that day. So you start thinking ahead. If the exam hasn't happened by Thursday, then it must be on Friday, because Friday is the last possible day. But if on Thursday morning I know that the exam must be on Friday, then it won't be a surprise. So you reason the exam can't be on Friday. Now remove Friday from the possible days. Next, think about Thursday. If the exam hasn't happened by Wednesday, then Thursday is the last possible day. But if I know on Wednesday morning that the exam can only be on Thursday, then the exam won't be a surprise. So Thursday is also impossible. By this logic, Friday and Thursday are ruled out. You continue this backward reasoning. If Thursday and Friday are impossible, then Wednesday becomes the last possible day. But if on Tuesday morning I know the exam must be Wednesday, then it won't be a surprise. So Wednesday is also impossible. Then Tuesday is eliminated for the same reason, because if Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday are impossible, Tuesday is the last remaining day after Monday. Finally, Monday is ruled out as well, because if you expect it on Monday, it can't be a surprise. Through this reasoning, every day is eliminated as a possible day for the exam. Your conclusion: a surprise exam can't happen at all. But then imagine the following scenario. Wednesday afternoon arrives. The teacher suddenly announces the exam will be tomorrow. You think, of course, I expected this, so it's not a surprise. Yet the next morning when the exam begins, you find yourself genuinely caught off guard. The exam was unexpected after all. How can this be? This is the heart of the paradox of the unexpected exam. It reveals a tension between logical deduction and lived experience, a contradiction between what seems inevitable in theory and what actually happens in practice. On paper, your reasoning says the exam can't be a surprise. In reality, it often is. The paradox shows how knowledge about future events can undermine the very conditions that define those events. If you know something is coming, it ceases to be a surprise. But if you don't know, then the element of surprise remains. This paradox isn't just a neat classroom puzzle. It strikes at the core of how we think about time, knowledge, and expectation. Consider life itself a series of moments, some planned and anticipated, others unplanned and unexpected. When we try to predict everything, we risk losing the essence of surprise, of wonder, of the unforeseen twist. The paradox also explores how our understanding of the future shapes the future itself. When people expect an event, they act differently. But if everyone expects the same thing, it changes the dynamic entirely. In economics, markets react to expectations, sometimes causing the very outcomes they predict, sometimes preventing them. In politics, strategies are built on anticipation, but surprises often disrupt the best-laid plans. The paradox of the unexpected exam invites us to reflect on these complexities. It shows us the limits of logic when applied to real-world situations that involve self-reference and uncertainty. Moreover, it challenges the idea that everything in life can be predicted or controlled. Some events resist anticipation no matter how hard we try. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of surprise and knowledge. What does it mean to be surprised? Is surprise simply the absence of knowledge? Or is it something deeper, a moment that breaks the chain of expectations? Think of the paradox like a dance between certainty and uncertainty. It highlights how knowledge itself can alter outcomes, sometimes in paradoxical ways. So what can we take away from this? Maybe the paradox encourages us to accept uncertainty as an inherent part of life. It suggests that not every future event can be logically deduced or anticipated, and that sometimes the most valuable moments are those that catch us unawares. Next time you face a situation that seems predictable or inevitable, remember the unexpected exam. The moment it arrives might surprise you precisely because you tried so hard to predict it. And in that surprise lies the beauty of the unknown, the spark that keeps life endlessly fascinating. As we drift toward the end of this journey, take a moment to let the paradoxes settle, not with answers, but with wonder. If even one idea tonight stirred something in you, a thought you can't quite shake, a quiet question echoing in your mind, then this moment was worth it. This channel is a space for seekers, thinkers, and dreamers like you, and every time you return, you help it grow into something deeper. So if you haven't already, consider subscribing, not just to follow along, but to become part of something unfolding. If this resonated, leave a like, share it with someone who'd appreciate the mystery, and let the paradox live on, not just in thought, but in conversation. Until next time, stay curious.